Welcome to the lecture to understand what is DNS, that is domain name service. Let's look at what challenge we're going to solving it here with the DNS. We said that every computer in the internet have a unique IP address, and that's how the IP address looks like, but it's hard to remember billions of IP addresses, right? So how do you solve that challenge? So let's understand that. Well, that can be solved via something called as DNS. Okay, every computer in the internet which has an IP address, you can give an English name that is easy to remember name. That is nothing but domain name service, DNS. Okay, DNS is nothing but an English name or an easy to remember name for your computer which has an IP address. Remember, you need to have an unique IP address, and to that unique IP address you assign the domain name system. And why do you do it? Why I have to give a domain name for an IP address? I can just use the IP address as I want. I don't want to have a domain name. Well, there's no problem, right? You can connect to any computer via the TCP IP. That is the rule of the protocol. You need to have an IP address. It's not a rule that you should have a DNS name, but you can even connect to any computer via the IP address. That's fine. But imagine a situation wherein you have to remember thousands of phone numbers, right? What you typically do is you, in the contact list, you assign a name to a phone number so that you don't have to remember the phone number. And really it is hard to remember numbers, and it's easy to remember names because the numbers are complex and it is difficult to remember. We have something called as domain name system, which gives us an English name to our IP address. Okay, so let's take an example. Okay, so we have a computer in the internet having this IP address. We can assign a host name or a domain name. You can even call this domain name or a host name something called as phptraining.com. And once this name is assigned to this IP address, so if you have to find the phptraining.com server, you don't have to remember the IP address now. You only have to say phptraining.com and you will connect to my computer. Okay, so remember, there is a linkage between your IP address and your host name. You have to create this link. First of all, you have to have this domain name purchased. Again, the domain name has to be unique, obviously, right? So you have to have a unique domain names, and each domain name is assigned to a computer's IP address. Well, if you want to have a name for your computer in the internet, you have to buy the domain name. Okay, so let's understand who sell this. So there are two types of providers in the market. One is called as web hosting providers. One is called as domain name providers. The web hosting providers sell space in the server. Typically, web hosting providers have the servers with IP addresses in the internet, and these servers are very huge. Okay, they have tons of space available. They have internet attached to it. It is in the internet and can be found with an IP address. So instead of putting our own server in the internet, we go to these web hosting providers and then we buy some space from them. Once you buy the space, you get that IP address and the space from the web hosting providers. Okay, and then you want to assign a domain name, that is the English name for your IP address. You go to something called as domain name providers, who basically sell a domain name. And once you buy the domain name, you have to do a configuration. You have to say, this is my domain name and this is my IP address. If someone is trying to access your domain name, that request is sent to the web hosting provider. So remember, there are two types of providers: web hosting providers and domain name providers. Web hosting providers sell space. They have unique IP addresses, so they sell space in their server. Domain name providers sell that English names that you can buy. It has to be unique in the internet and you can attach to that IP address. Okay, so let's look at an example who are providing the web hosting providers and also domain names. Okay, so let's look at the web hosting providers. So HostGator is one of the vendor or the provider in the market who provide web hosting, and they provide web hosting for $2.75 per month, and they have their own plan. Okay, so let's look at different plans that they have. You have dedicated hosting, means you get the full control of the PC. You have dedicated control, full root access and scalable resources. There's some differences in the performances here. Then they have the web hosting for WordPress. You want to install WordPress, they have special softwares to do that. Then they have a simple drag and drop where you don't get very much control on the server, but you get this softwares to create websites. Okay, so let's look at their plan of web hosting. You click on web hosting. So here are their plan. Okay, and many of them, all the plans come up with this unmetered bandwidth, means you have unlimited bandwidth, so you don't run out of the bandwidths of the internet. And what they are saying is single domain, unlimited domain, and unlimited domains means you can point n number of domain names to this one server. For hatchling plan you can have single domain, for baby plan you can have unlimited domains, and similarly for business you can have unlimited. But once you go to business plan, you get this dedicated IP. For hatchling and baby you will definitely get an IP address, but that is shared with others. Okay, and when you go to business plan you get this dedicated IP address. Okay, and you'll get the free SS certificate, and you get many other components of it. The most important thing that you have to understand is they are selling space in the server. They have this server, massive server, and they are selling space in their servers. So you get the space, you get the IP address, some are shared, some are dedicated, and you pay the price to get those details. If you click on technical specs, right, you will see some of the details of that server, and they'll tell you what other offerings they are giving you. Like in terms of programming and database, they give you MySQL installed on that server. You get that cPanel to access, you get email feature, you get all this support and all those tools available. Okay, so they are actually selling you a space on the server with some software installed on it. Okay, similarly you can go to Bluehost. Bluehost also have web hostings. Okay, they have WordPress specially hosting, e-commerce hosting, and they get dedicated hosting as well. Dedicated hosting is one server, they give it to you, and you have the full control of that server. And when they talk about server, obviously they talk about cores, space, RAM, bandwidth, IP addresses. They're really talking about computer, right? They're talking about computer which is in the internet and have an public IP addresses. So first thing you have to do is you have to buy a space, right? You have to buy a space, and you have to buy a space in any of the servers. You can start small, like $2 per month, or you can go up to dedicated hosting where you get to have your own server, and you can get to choose what kind of server you want and even what OS you want, right? That is the first step. So these are the vendors. One is HostGator, another is Bluehost, and there's DigitalOcean as well. In DigitalOcean you create something called as droplets. Okay, let's look at what is the droplet. Let's look at Ubuntu. And to create the droplets, they give you a price. Let's say you want one CPU, 25 GB SSD disk, 1 terabyte of transfer, that's the bandwidth, 1 GB of RAM. You have to pay $5 per month. So they'll give you the server, and then you are on your own. You do install whatever you want to install on that server. So these are called as web hosting providers. They provide space in that server. They even provide you server access. They even let you choose what type of servers you want, and then you have to just pay the price. Okay, once you buy the space and the IP address, you need to have an unique English names, right? And where do you buy the English names? You buy that from a domain name provider. And if you go to godaddy.com, so godaddy.com is really very famous for selling domain names. So the first thing, when you go to their homepage, they'll ask you what is the domain name you're searching for. Okay, similarly if you go to namecheap.com, they will help you find a domain name. Once you purchase a domain name, then you can go inside the configuration to configure a domain name with the IP address. Okay, so let's do a quick check of what is the domain name available or not. Let's say you want to buy yahoo.com, then they'll say yahoo.com is taken, you cannot have it. Okay, so domain names are unique. It's an English name that you're buying. You're not assigning it to a server first, right? You will buy this, and then once you have this server, they'll give an IP address. Then you do the linkage between this server and that server. That's a configuration altogether. But remember, on a high level, there are two different kind of people in the market. One is the web hosting provider, that is the HostGator, Bluehost, DigitalOcean. They are giving you the web server. They're giving you a server with a space in it, and then they have a unique IP address. There are another type of providers who provide you the domain name, they are selling the domain name so that you can assign this domain name to this IP addresses. So it's easy to see you have two different kind of providers in the market. One is really selling the web hosting, another is selling the domain name. So now that we have seen the web hosting providers and domain name providers, let's understand how the DNS works. Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's say Bob has purchased the web hosting and also he has purchased the domain name and he has assigned his domain name to his IP address. Well, remember this: when Jim types bob.com, the computer doesn't understand DNS name. The computer only understands IP addresses. The TCP/IP protocol, the rule says you need to have an unique IP address. The rule never talks about DNS. So there should be a way to convert your host name into an IP address, and that is done via something called as DNS servers. So in the internet, there will be so many DNS servers always syncing each other to tell that this, based on this DNS name, this is the IP address. So once you purchase from GoDaddy.com, they sync that detail. Like let's say you purchase Yahoo.com, then the GoDaddy.com will sync those details of your DNS server to all the DNS servers in the internet. Okay, so remember, there is a DNS server in the internet which converts your host name, that is the domain name, to the IP address. Once you find the IP address, then that Bob computer can be uniquely identified in the internet. Then the TCP/IP protocol can help to connect and communicate the message to that particular system. Okay, so that's the role of the DNS server. So if you look at the internet as a whole, right, every computer has an IP address and every computer get to have an DNS name. Okay, and then there are DNS servers sitting in the internet. Whenever someone types the DNS, then that DNS is converted into an IP address first, and then the communication happens on that IP address. In the previous example, when you say ping yahoo.com, ping google.com, the yahoo.com and google.com are nothing but the English names, right? They are DNS names, and conversion of that DNS name into an IP address is done by the DNS server. So remember, in the internet there are DNS servers. The job of the DNS server is to convert the DNS name into an IP address, and once the conversion happens, then it's easy to find those servers in the internet. Alright, so let's do a definition of what is DNS. So DNS stands for domain name system. That's the full form of DNS. Well, DNS name can also be called as host name, and the main purpose is to easy to remember names that is assigned to an IP address of a computer in the internet. Okay, because it is hard to remember IP address, we buy this domain name, we assign the domain name to the IP address, and in the internet the DNS server take care of converting that domain name into an IP address. Okay, so DNS server basically helps to convert host name to IP address. You have to remember this concept, because once you buy the domain name, you need to know there are DNS servers, okay, which actually helps to convert the host names to IP address. And then you have to purchase the domain name, and once you purchase them, you have to do this setting by yourself. No one is going to do this for you, because no one knows what is your IP address. So once you buy the domain name, you have to map this IP address to the domain name. Okay, so understand this concept of how DNS work and what are the components of it, and what you have to do once you buy the domain name as well. So let's look at the problem that we have seen with Jim and Bob. So now Jim and Bob can identify themselves with the IP address, and also with the DNS. Now Bob can buy an DNS name, that is bob.com, and then he can match this bob.com with the IP address, and Jim can find Bob computer via the bob.com, that is nothing but the DNS name. So now we have solved the challenge of how Jim can really find the Bob computer, but there's one more challenge. Let's look at it. Well, the challenge is you can use TCP/IP protocol to transfer the data, any data, right? But you want to transfer a specific files, like the text files, pictures and videos. Then what protocol can help? TCP/IP is basically a transport protocol. What is mean by transport protocol? It's basically doesn't understand what you're transferring. It just transfers zeros and ones, right? It is just the purpose of TCP/IP is to find that computer via the IP address and transfer the data. It doesn't really care what you're transferring. Okay, but if you want to take a level up and then say, okay, I just want to transfer files, pictures and videos. These are nothing but the file formats, right? and you want to transfer this from Jim computer to Bob computer, or you want to pull those information from the Bob computer, your protocol can help. Okay, that can be done via the HTTP protocol. So let's understand what is HTTP in the next section.